Hello. Good evening. Am I good in the back? Got a thumbs up. Okay, so I guess I'm good in the back. Well, thank you all for joining us tonight. I appreciate you coming out. I'm going to read verbatim this list of talking points because I'm that much of a bore. But I don't want to mess up acknowledging and giving gratitudes to all of our wonderful sponsors. So first and foremost, thank you for joining us here at the Wisconsin Book Festival this week. My name is Andrew Hannes. I'm the director of the Illuminating Discovery Hub here in the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery. Mouthful. And we're grateful, first and foremost, to the Madison Public Library. Thank you. And thank you to the Madison Public Library Foundation. Yeah, we got claps in the back. All right, you can clap. So thank you so much, and thank you to all the other sponsors that helped. The Wisconsin Book Festival has been a longtime partner and friend of the Wisconsin Science Festival, so we're excited to have the opportunity to conduct the book talks here this evening in the DeLuca Forum. As you can see, it's a very pretty building. The lights change color, and yeah, so I can talk ad infinitum about that. But be sure afterwards to stop outside of the DeLuca Forum and grab a copy of tonight's book, Optimal Illusions, which is being provided by Mystery to Me. There are pre-signed copies available for purchase. So we are joined tonight for a special treat by Dr. Coco Krumme. And she is an applied mathematician from MIT and author of the book tonight, Optimal Illusions, The False Promise of Optimization. Her new book explores how the human species has sought to maximize the efficiency of basically everything. And from agriculture to Zappos lighters, energy consumption to the Manhattan Project, and Isaac Newton to modern day government, optimization has crept into every orifice of human experience. Maps, map directions, search queries, and many other emerging technologies have taken away much of our serendipity to the human interaction and maybe the culprit to the anxiety that we experience in modern day. So Coco's book takes the reader on this journey through how over centuries people have sought out efficiency only to find a complexity and sometimes grave trade-offs in their place. So with that, I would love to welcome Coco.
Thank you, Andrew. Oh, wow. I was going to test it, but it works like magic. Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you for that very generous introduction. I feel like I don't even need to give a talk after he summarized the book so, so eloquently and so well. I'm really glad to be here. I was about to mention this to Andrew, actually, but my father is actually from Wisconsin. And as a result, maybe in third or fourth grade, I wrote a book report. Or it wasn't a book report, we had to write about a state of our choice. I grew up in Berkeley, California, far cry from here. And I remember going to the library, and I got this wonderful book on the Midwest, and there was a section on Wisconsin, and I, of course, rephrased everything in my, there were actually a few books, and I put everything in my own words except for one phrase, which I didn't know exactly what it meant in third grade, so I copied verbatim, and the teacher actually knows. She was like, "Did you come up with this?" And the phrase was, Wisconsin's voters are fiercely independent. And ever since it's stuck in my mind because it's, I got called out for my first and last instance of plagiarism. But I've found it to be true with the, the limited interactions I've had with Wisconsinites. So I thought I'd open with that because I do want to get a sense of the audience here. It's a very different audience, I would guess, than some of the other places like San Francisco where I've given talks where the first question I ask is how many people work in optimization? And if you're in San Francisco, at least half the room raises their hand. So I'll ask that question here. How many work in optimization? Okay, we've got 1, 2, 3. Okay, can I ask just a quick word on what it is in technology and academic research? In which? Okay, yeah.
Agriculture and power automate, trying to use bots as much as possible.
Interesting, yeah. We had one over here. No, declined to state. Okay, and then the second question I always ask is how many people are interested in personal optimization? So optimizing their fitness routine or their sleep. Okay. So a few more hands. So again, I like this diversity. It's a more diverse audience than I found on the coast, for example. So my background is in optimization. I grew up in the Bay Area as it was on the cusp of this tech boom. And as Andrew mentioned, I went on to do my PhD at MIT as kind of the social media companies were coming to the fore, and this promise of big data was, on the tip of everybody's tongue. But I'd always felt kind of this resistance to, like, why are we optimizing in the first place? And I had these, even after I returned then to San Francisco to lead data science teams in various startups, and then I founded my own little consultancy. I was kind of a holdout in certain ways. Like, I held on to my flip phone for a number of years while everybody had these fancy new things, and I would insist on walking everywhere or writing down directions with instead of using the maps application, which actually I didn't have because I didn't have the smartphone. But when I needed to, I'd look it up, on paper maps and then map out my walking route. So I started to wonder at this disconnect, and at the same time there was this incredible frothiness in San Francisco, and arguably that percolated out far beyond the Bay Area. It's funny to think back, even just 5 years ago, these big tech companies like Google and Facebook were seen as infallible, right? And a lot of people wanted, their dream was to go to be a software engineer at Google. And you'd see photos of, like, the huge, the sushi chefs and the Indian buffet, the endless abundance of food options. They were people who did your laundry for you if you worked for Facebook. And it was just sort of it was this new Gilded Age. And, those companies still have a huge amount of power, but I think our belief in them has faded somewhat. And even before then, I came back to San Francisco around 2013, and was just starting to feel this disconnect, and was working in tech, and there was this frothiness, and I was disillusioned. And I basically did two things at once, which is, I should say, let me take a step back. I was disillusioned, but I was still very, I had this romantic, and I still have this very romantic notion about the power of mathematics and statistics. And what got me into it in the first place was the idea that you could take a model, right, an abstraction, and use it to understand the world in a new way. And you see so many innovations, right, in agriculture, having a mental model of how, as simple as the most, the earliest efforts in plant breeding, up to the genetic modifications that we see today. These all rely on these mental models in order to map the world and to make innovations. And we can argue about whether those innovations are for good or for ill. And part of what I talk about in the book is that it's a lot of optimizations have been for good, but we haven't fully acknowledged the trade-offs or the shortcomings of our optimizations. So anyway, I had this romanticism still about mathematics, but also a disillusionment about the kind of power struggles and the bad behavior in the tech world. And so I, kept working in that world. I didn't sort of dive into it fully, but I kept, doing what I loved, which was building these models. And I started my little consultancy. I was working with teams, mostly R&D teams, to figure out how to build these models at scale for climate science, for agriculture, for materials science. And at the same time, I did something that looked very bizarre to a lot of my peers, which is that I bought this falling down cabin on a very remote place in the Pacific Northwest. And at first, it was just sort of like a project. We would go up there in the summers and kind of fix things up. And then when I got more geographical freedom with my company and just being able to work remotely, but travel, to the folks I was working with, I sort of found myself there full time and realized, not having grown up in a small town myself, that this was a very different place than San Francisco, and the skills that I had learned that not only worked in a city, but worked in a city that thrived on optimization and technology and thinking analytically. Those weren't the skills. Those were pretty much useless in a small town where the things that mattered were your ongoing relationships with your neighbors, your skills in building and growing a garden, and the skills you could contribute directly to the community. So that's a long preamble, but that disconnect I felt between those two worlds, along with having been steeped in this and studying it for my PhD, was what motivated the book. And I wanted to understand how this language that was so prevalent in technology in the Bay Area, where it had come from. Why everybody, it seemed, was talking about optimizing their diet, maximizing their free time, optimizing their calendars, right? Like, why businesses were talking about optimizing productivity, almost to this humorous extent, but it really was the way things were working. And I started spending time in parts of the Midwest. There's a whole chapter in the book on beet farmers, one particular beet farmer in the Red River Valley in North Dakota. I started spending time with corn and soy operations in Iowa, and looking at, both from individuals' perspective and sort of a historical perspective, how did agriculture become so industrialized and optimized to the point where its productivity increased more than any other industry in the last 100 years, more than any other American industry. And what have we lost as a result of that? And there are a number of other industries, as Andrew pointed out. And the two passages that I thought I'd read tonight, I'm going to skip over the intellectual history. There's a lot of it. I trace the roots of optimization in some of America's founding principles, and look at the utilitarian movement in the UK and how that had, optimization, or the modern version of optimization that we see today, has its roots in that kind of philosophy. I look at the tidying guru, Marie Kondo, and how she sort of epitomizes this. So I look at that history. I also talk about, what are the conceptual components of an optimization, right? What do we need conceptually and mathematically? Not in a very technical way, but what does it mean to optimize, right? And we need to be able to look at the world in a certain way, which arguably We've built those building blocks over the last few hundred years. And I think I've alluded to this before, but it's a very American idea, right? You see optimization in a lot of places in the West. You don't really see this drive for productivity in a lot of other cultures, but I think you see it very pronounced in America. And so one of the questions I had going into writing this book was why is that? So I will read. How are we on time? What's that? Good? Okay. So I'm going to read a passage about what happens when optimization breaks down. And this is both when a particular system that's been overly optimized breaks down, but I also use it to talk about what happens when this idea of optimization that we've lived with for so long, it starts to fray. Okay, so this chapter is titled Metaphoric Breakdown. It came out of the blue. In February 2021, half of Texas shut down. The polar vortex, a low-pressure zone of cold air, reached its icy tentacles southward, battering the southeast with winter storms for nearly a week. Temperatures crawled below zero, hitting records for the century and blanketing normally balmy latitudes in snow and ice. Households turned up the heat just as various power suppliers were going down. The Texas electric grid partially collapsed and was on the verge of shutting off entirely. Some 46,000 megawatts of power had to be taken offline, equal to the consumption of 9 million homes on a high-demand day. Natural gas pipelines froze, valves were iced shut, and windmills stopped turning. When natural gas is cut, gas-fired power plants can't generate as much electricity. And natural gas, which heats about 35% of homes in Texas, relies on electricity to be processed. The grid reacted with rolling blackouts. At the peak of the crisis, nearly 5 million customers across the state were without power, and many more faced intermittent blackouts. The streets in Austin were frozen. Boil water orders were put in place after power was cut to water treatment plants. Houston residents burned charcoal and scrap wood to keep warm and lined up to fill water buckets from public spigots. Near South Padre Island, rescued baby sea turtles were warmed in makeshift indoor pools. On top of that, because of extremely low supply and high demand, the price per megawatt hour for electricity jumped from around $30 to around $9,000. As Texans emerged from the cold and the bills rolled in, many were astounded to find they owed several $1,000s, even as their homes remained frozen. The Texas disaster provided a sort of release, an external, visible, feelable disaster. The lights were out, the house was cold, fingers were numb, water boiled on the stove. Supermarket shelves were empty, and cars spun out in the icy streets. Families huddled in blanket forts and ate cold meals by candlelight. Finally, after distant wars and unseen viruses, this apocalypse followed the script. It made sense. We saw in the previous chapter a malaise rooted in the disconnect between the promise and reality of optimization. Perhaps Mike Campbell describes the feeling best. Mike is an unruly war veteran making his way through Ernest Hemingway's novel, The Sun Also Rises. His hard drinking earns him a handful of enemies, a mountain of stories, and a whole lot of debt. When asked how bankruptcy befell him, he replies succinctly, 2 ways. First gradually, then suddenly. Leading up to the financial crisis of 2008, the defaults on Florida ranch homes trickled in slowly at first, as the credit default swaps built up. Decades of poor fire management compounded gradually in California, along with suburban homes encroaching bit by bit into fuel-filled forest. And no one paid much heed to the small fractures in supply chains building over the early years of this century, until a pandemic hit, when they seemed suddenly to break down. Gradually, there's a buildup of abstractions and automation, of dry fuel and overextended loans. Gradually, slack is lost and fragilities grow. Gradually, those in charge of a system lose track both of its design and of its vulnerabilities. Gradually, we sweep things under the rug. And then suddenly, the lights are off and the pipe's frozen solid. So I go on to talk about Texas and why the grid, like many things in Texas, it's unique to Texas. And Texans take a certain pride in its independence. There are 3 power grids in the US, or 3 main ones: the Eastern, Western, and Texas, which kind of stands on its own. And the way that it was built up was optimized for a certain set of conditions. And the builders of these systems take into account these edge cases or these disaster situations. And for a lot of people, the system worked exactly as it should have, right? There were market mechanisms that drove the price up to $9,000 when it was 30 in normal times. And the fragilities that were part of this system were a trade-off of having power on demand and relatively cheap. And I think that's sort of how somebody steeped in this idea of optimization would look at it. I think for people living through this, it wasn't how it was supposed to work, right? We'd gotten used to flipping on the switch and the lights come on. And we'd assumed that there was some buffer against these breakdowns, and there wasn't. So I go on in the chapter to profile a kind of a buckaroo, if you will, an oil man with a very big Texan personality, who rose, or his company rose to prominence by collecting, first very manually, records from courthouses and geologic records, and synthesizing all of this data in order to optimize how oil exploration is done. And he gets fabulously rich doing this, but I also sort of perceive a certain sadness, right? Where when you're exploring and when the world is yours to map, it's kind of fun, And when you've optimized and you've collected this data, there's a loss, or there's something that becomes, at least for this guy, a little bit boring. And I think that's simultaneously the place we are now, if you'll bear with this metaphor for a little bit, is that we've optimized so many things, right? And we're increasingly seeing these breakdowns in supply chains, in the electric grid. But we also feel this kind of malaise, because it's like, well, we've picked up these low-hanging fruit, right? We've made our world very, very comfortable through a lot of these optimizations. And it's sort of like for, people who are like this Texas guy who are interested in exploration, like where do you go next, right? Like it's fun when things are on the rise, when you're optimizing, but it's less fun to pick up the messes and put things back together, as they're breaking down. So maybe before, I had another passage to read, but I'm a little tired of hearing my own voice. So maybe we could pause for some questions, and then if there's time, I could go back and read a very different passage. But I'm curious if so what I've said so far has raised any questions, or if there were any questions coming in.
Yeah. Oh, right in the front, Julie. Mic there.
Oh, sorry. Thanks for coming. when you were beginning to speak, I was starting to think time is money and capitalism rules in the United States. So I don't know if that fits into your history at all, or if that would be a component of why we are so interested in optimization in the United States or countries, pure countries.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a Venn diagram of this market-driven impulse and the impulse to optimize. Capitalism is it's about optimizing for, or letting markets optimize, setting things in motion with markets to optimize, often for dollar value, but also there's this notion of the marketplace of ideas, right? So I see it more as like a system that sets things in motion with markets. And of course, it's problematic in all sorts of ways. It's also, has led to innovations and, a lot of wealth in other ways. I see optimization as related because it's seeking to maximize something. Maybe, I can take a step back and start with a very basic definition of an optimization. The book is not very technical, but I'll give the non-technical example I use in the book, because it might help point out some of the similarities and differences between something like market capitalism. So the example I use is of making lemonade. And, suppose you want to make the best lemonade, and optimization is all about making the best, right, and maximizing something. So the first step in any optimization is kind of to bound your system and define what you're optimizing for. And in this case, it would be lemonade, but you have to define that. What actually is the best lemonade? Is it something that's very sweet? Is it tart? Is it some combination of those two? And then you outline what fits into those bounds, right? What are your constraints, right? Do you have a certain number of lemons on hand, right? Are you limited by your lemon supply? Are you limited by your water or your sugar? Can you include other ingredients like strawberries in your lemonade? Do you have a factory to make your lemonade, or are you making it at home? So how quickly can you make your lemonade? What price are you able to sell it at? So it's taking all of these features and kind of throwing them into a blender. And often that's a computer kind of taking all your constraints and throwing out, okay, here's the recipe for the best lemonade. So oftentimes the effects are, of optimizations are similar to those of a capitalist systems, but the process is a little bit different, right? Whereas in capitalism, you have this market and you say, the market's just gonna figure it out, right? And then in an optimization, you're actually engineering for the best, right? You think about engineers like building a bridge, which is a very complex form of making lemonade. And they're actually actively, they're not letting the market figure it out. They're actively building that recipe for the bridge. Does that make sense as an answer to your question?
You actually jumped to what my question was, which was defining optimization. But I often think of it also as related to things being faster, being able to be this prioritization of things being fast and being cheap. But I guess not like Errol Morris, not out of control, but fast and cheap. And there's a certain definition of the best, but to me, optimizing, making things fast and efficient seems to, in itself, often be the goal. And I'm wondering, what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, absolutely. As a purely mathematical concept, it's sort of agnostic to you could optimize for anything, right? You could optimize for the greatest happiness or well-being, right? But in practice, that's often what it leads to because of the prior question, because it's often merged with this sort of market capitalism that's all about using the markets to maximize for revenues, and that often entails going faster and scaling up. That's another word you hear often, like how does it scale? And that is, something that I think when we think about both the gains and the losses of our optimized systems in America, that is one that comes to the fore. And I'll come back to agriculture again, right? In the year 2023, we have some of the cheapest food in the history of humanity, and the most widely, its prices have gone up a little bit in the last few years, but like this era, I think it's the figure is sevenfold or something. The prices have I forget what commodity that is, but just we have incredibly cheap food, and we have an incredible abundance of food with these transportation networks that are distributed to, like we could buy New Zealand kiwis in Madison. It's at the same time, we've lost something when we have that scale, right? We not only have the fragilities that we see with the supply chain, with the electric grid, we see that with agricultural systems where, if people are growing one thing and it fails, it's a lot less robust to natural disasters. But we've also lost things that are harder to quantify, like the fabric of certain farming communities that once had the many of the kids in the school or the people in a local community were directly involved in feeding, if not only that community, but the state or the general area. Now you might have one or two that are, even if it's still a family-owned operation, it's very much an operation that's global, that is, whose crops are traded on the global markets, that aren't, feeding the local community at all anymore.
Hi. Maybe on more of like an anecdotal note, I had a question about, I thought it was interesting that, you moved from the Bay Area, right, like San Francisco or Berkeley, to, I guess, Boston for MIT, and then to the Pacific Northwest. I had a similar journey. I went from New York City to Boston for school, and now I'm here for a job. I just recently moved, and it's a weird feeling. But the story about Austin or just Texas and the power grid, what I took away from that was, that grid was clearly optimized, but it was optimized for the wrong thing. And so that sort of like the journey from California to the Pacific Northwest, similar to my journey from New York to here, is like making me think about, are we optimizing our lives for the wrong thing? For example, like in New York City, I felt like I was optimizing my life in a certain way and it felt right, but then being in a different place, that feels sort of like thrown out of whack, and I'm questioning, like what is the right way that you should you be optimizing your life at all, I guess. But yeah.
Yeah.
Big one.
I
Didn't know you were going to be giving life coaching, but I think it's a great question.
Do you have a response, or?
Well, based on what I've learned from your book, I think that each circumstance dictates its own set of review, and so you have to understand what those outcomes are in order to know that you're going to be making the best decision, knowing that you might not know all possible decisions or all possible outcomes based on one decision. So you don't always know with 100% certainty that you're making the most optimal choice.
Yeah.
For specifically a life lesson, or a life kind of choice.
I couldn't even tell
optimization.
if there was a question in there. Or you're just expressing sort of like I definitely don't have advice for you because I don't even know you, and I don't like to give advice in general. Because yeah. No, I mean I think as part of the book talks and promotion, I was on this podcast with another, the guy running it was this guy, Adam Grant, who's a professor. And he'd also invited on Barry Schwartz. I don't know if any of you are familiar with him. He wrote a book. He's written a number of books, but his most well-known one is called The Paradox of Choice. And it's about how you would think that when you're given 10 choices in the grocery store, right, 10 choices for ketchup, right, that would make you happier because you would pick the ketchup that's the most perfect for you, right, versus you only have one choice of ketchup or two choices. And what he and others have found through experiments is that actually the opposite is true, that the people with only two choices of ketchup are happier with their decision than the people who have 10. And it's because we become overwhelmed by choice and by trying to optimize, this very inconsequential thing, right? Like the difference between these ketchups is probably 0. It's probably just the same ketchup actually with different labels put on it. So I do think that especially like our younger generations were kind of often paralyzed by these kinds of questions, like where should I live and what should I do? I know I faced times like that, like, how do I make decisions about life that when there's this seeming abundance of choice, but also these kind of unseen limitations in what you actually can do. So I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but I find it interesting that there is this generational difference in that older generations maybe weren't given such an abundance of choices and don't have such paralysis or such need to optimize that the younger generations do.
Hello? Okay, so I think you brought up 2 points about optimization. One is like the robustness, like as you optimize more, maybe the system is less robust. And another thing is that when you optimize so much, things kind of get boring, right? So for the first point, I was thinking maybe you could just optimize for robustness as well. You take that into account. And if it fails 0.05% of the time, hey, you take that chance. Maybe it's worth it, right? You take that into account. But for the second point, I'm not sure, how to fix that without how to kind of fix that. It's kind of like I think in my grandparents' generation, they were happy just getting enough food to eat. That made them very fulfilled. But right now, that does not make me fulfilled. I want more than just getting enough to eat. And that's as a result of like so much optimization allowing me to get so much. So to me, kind of like optimization is almost synonymous with just making things better according to some measure. And once things just get good enough, once it's comfortable, like, well, what do I do now? And and I think that is like it's kind of what you were talking about just now. That is kind of the hard question that our generation, or at least my generation, have to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely.
So should we just not optimize? Should we have gone back to my grandparents' times, or like what is the middle ground?
Well, thank you for asking that question. It's like you've queued up a bunch of things that are in the book, but I failed to talk about. So I feel like you should get a kickback or something for. I'm also wondering, are you an engineer of some sort?
I'm a mathematics PhD.
Okay, there you go. But I find this response. I mean, it's something that was an impulse for me as well, and I find it in a lot of scientifically oriented or engineering oriented people, which is like, well, yeah, optimization is problematic, so, but maybe we're just not optimizing for the right thing, right? Or maybe we need to optimize for downtime, in these systems that are over-optimized to get rid of the fragilities, right? So like if airline schedules are, wound too tight, we need to optimize for having more space between flights so that the pilots don't time out and one delay doesn't cascade into the whole system, which is actually what they do, right? So that's the schedulers are running these scenarios, and they are optimizing. They're trading off the efficiency of the whole system for the worst case scenarios, and the trying to not have those be totally bad. And I just think that this response is really interesting. It shows to me how pervasive this language of optimization is. It's like, okay, if we're not optimizing for the right thing, then let's just shift what we're optimizing for, right? Like if our optimizing for money and profit is making us unhappy, let's, and you see this a lot in corporate speak, right? We're going to optimize for customer happiness now, or we're going to optimize for social responsibility or environmental outcomes. And often those are just, thinly veiled marketing ploys to actually optimize for dollars. But it's also just speaks to how pervasive this idea of optimizing is. And to get back to your question, right, what do we do? I do look at two kind of approaches. One is the one I just described, which is it's popular in Silicon Valley. It's popular in the corporate world, which is okay, optimization, it has some shortcomings, right? We try to climb the mountain too fast. We try to scale too quickly. So let's build in, let's de-optimize in an optimal way, right? And so that, I show why that doesn't work. I mean, you all laughed. You probably understand already why it doesn't work. But the other solution is kind of this more romantic one. I profile a wildlife ecologist. He's a member of the Eastern Shoshone tribe, and he's trying to restore the American buffalo, the bison, to the plains and get back to this state before this huge slaughter of bison in the late 19th century, which was an optimization of sorts, a very barbaric one, to clear land in order to put in uses like cattle grazing that were more profitable. And it was also a direct attack on these indigenous ways of life. While I personally may actually agree with his mission, which is, I think we, as American people now should be restoring this species. I think there's something that's a little bit impossible about trying to return to a specific past reference point, right? Which is another solution that's often proposed. It's like, oh, we're too optimized. Let's go back to a time when we had subsistence farming, right? And 1 out of 2 people or 1 out of 10 were farmers. I think that's a very romantic idea. I think it's, number one, impossible where we are today, and also maybe not a good thing, right? Like modernization has brought us, and optimizations that come with it have brought us increased lifespans, have allowed us to have all kinds of different professions rather than, being tied to agriculture, as we were not many generations ago. So that's all to say, I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's somewhere between those two extremes, which is like de-optimizing optimally and just like unwinding it all and going back to some past golden era. Got a few more over there.
I'm interested that you said that your book kind of frames this in terms of like optimization in like dominant American culture. A lot of aspects to tendencies to optimize or drawbacks from overly optimizing I would expect to be fairly universal. So like what pieces have you observed that you suspect are primarily part of like dominant American culture or might be more universal to like people anywhere?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what's universal is that as humans, we like to, we're a tool using and building species, right? And we like to improve the world around us. And that's one of the things that distinguishes us from other animals. I think the reason I say it's particularly American, I'm a big reader of American literature and history, and I think there's something about this kind of engineering mindset that is very American. I think the idea that, the idea of manifest destiny and of that, this mythos, right? That we have the European settlers, came to this continent and saw it as something to conquer and something to write their story on. And I think that those kind of ideals are still very present in, I think there are a lot of things that divide us as Americans, but this idea of pulling yourself by your bootstraps, right, and creating the world in the way you want it to be, that's still a very American myth. And that's not to say it doesn't exist in other places in the world, but it's something that does dominate our literature and our history and our ideas about ourselves. So I do think it's tied in that way, and I also think that there are sort of particular instances in the specific intellectual history of like the mathematical technique. A lot of it was developed in our universities, in our early writings. I say ours, my family wasn't even here then, but like insofar as we're Americans here, right? The American history and literature is very tied in.
I think we have time for one more question.
Sure. I think I can talk loud enough. I'd like you to spend a little bit of time talking about illusions. You talk about optical illusions. I'm thinking, if you go down to Atlanta, Georgia, when I went down there 50 years ago, there was a circle highway. And when I went back there 20 years later, there was another circle. When I went back 20 years later, there was another circle. Is that what you're talking about? Because what happens with the optimizations, of course, is you have traffic jams. You have people being just removed out of those areas. Is that what you're trying to try? The illusions of optimization? Is that what it is?
Yeah, I mean, I picked it. I don't know when it came to me. I had a different working title for the book, but then I was just thinking about it. I was like, oh, that's catchy, because there's optical illusion. So it's obviously a play on optical illusions. And I do like that the visual of the Atlanta circles, right? That's something you can see in a time lapse of aerial photos. I mean, it just quite simply, it's what it is, right? It's like the one of the points of the book is that these optimizations that surround us and whose language we've come to live with, oftentimes promise so much And those promises, you know, many of them are true and hold water, but they often are illusory as well, right? They're not, we can't have everything for nothing, right? Like there are always trade-offs in life. There's no free lunch. So that's the illusory part of it, that there haven't been losses along with all of the gains that we've gotten from optimization.
Wow. Thank you all so much for asking questions. I didn't get to ask any of mine, but that's okay. These were wonderful questions, and thank you so much, Coco, for reading the excerpt and answering everybody's questions. Everybody remember, Coco's book is right outside the door, so you can grab one of the pre-signed books outside. Thank you again for coming and supporting the Wisconsin Book Festival. It is also the Wisconsin Science Festival, so I almost messed that up. But we are partners, and we are, again, always happy to have the Wisconsin Book Festival joining in some of our events. And make sure to stop by Mystery Me outside. All right. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.